You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Disease Du Jour podcast. I'm your host, Carly Sisson, and in this episode, I spoke with Dr. Erin Newkirk about contagious equine metritis and the current outbreak that's happening in Florida. The Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Erin Newkirk is co-founder of Wellgrove Equine, an equine wellness, reproduction, and CEM quarantine facility in South Florida. She is a 2007 graduate of the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine and began practicing in South Florida the same year, becoming a well-rounded veterinarian proficient in all aspects of equine medicine. In 2019, she decided to chase her entrepreneurial dream, starting Wellgrove Equine. Among many things, Dr. Newkirk continuously strives to enhance and develop Wellgrove Equine's reproduction services. In addition, Dr. Newkirk is one of the most experienced professionals involved in the testing procedures for CEM import in the United States and was chosen by the Department of Agriculture to lead the symposium on CEM protocol. Thank you, Dr. Newkirk, for joining us today.
Thank you, Carly. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about a pretty topical subject. Do you want to get us started just with a brief overview of CEM? What is it? How does it spread? And what adverse effects does it cause?
Great. So CEM is very topical right now at the moment because we have an ongoing case here within the U.S. So I'm glad you guys have brought this to the attention of others and national, basically. Contagious equine metritis, also known as CEM or CEM, some people call it that. It's a highly infectious venereal disease that's caused by Tailorella equigenitalis, which is a bacteria, and it's actually a very treatable bacteria. The spread of it actually happens through breeding activities as well as through human activities. So sheath cleaning or through your collection equipment, or even as simple as the bucket handle of the wash bucket from stallion to stallion is one of the ways it could be transmitted. And as far as adverse effects, in mares, it typically causes a temporary infertility, but in stallions, it doesn't seem to cause any clinical infection itself, but they can be silent carriers, and that's the most important part to remember.
So where is CEM endemic? And up until this recent outbreak, it's been pretty non-existent in the U.S. So is there a reason that we've been largely immune here in this country?
Yeah, so CEM goes way back, and it was first diagnosed in the 70s in England, and then there was presence of it in the U.S. in the 70s as well. And it was eradicated from the U.S. through an aggressive quarantine and treatment protocol and retesting. Since then, it has been sporadic here because we do have a strong quarantine and testing and treatment protocol for anything coming from what's believed to be CEM endemic countries. And that list includes Japan, South Africa, Korea, all of the EU countries, as well as countries outside of Europe, including Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So any horses coming from those countries have to undergo an additional quarantine to clear CEM. And this is only stallions and mares that have to undergo that process before they're allowed to go free within the United States.
What are some of the current vulnerabilities for CEM spread in the U.S.? Maybe we can speak about, recently imported horses and how that can be a potential risk factor for the disease sort of spreading within the country.
Yeah. So the biggest thing is we've had a pretty robust program and have had quite few outbreaks of CEM within this country since eradicating it in the 70s. And the whole goal is to keep it that way. The most recent outbreak, and we'll get into that details in this conversation as well, the important thing in that is actually, in this particular one, is geldings. Some imported horses, especially from these endemic countries, if they're a male, a lot of times they'll geld them and bring them in as a gelding. So if it's a stallion, they geld and bring them in. And then they can avoid the CEM import procedures and they don't have to undergo any additional testing. Those new geldings could still have the organism present. And so they could be bringing CEM into our country unknowingly. And it's fine typically because they're not undergoing breeding activities. But this most recent outbreak that we have in the US was actually spread amongst most of the geldings within the herd via sheath cleaning, and just the simple procedure of a groom doing a sheath cleaning from gelding to gelding, and actually transmitted it within their geldings and their breeding stock. And that's how it came to light.
Today's Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health's Prestige Equirab vaccine. Prestige Equirab is the only monovalent rabies vaccine specifically designed for horses. Equirab is trusted by veterinarians for its safety and long-lasting protection. One smooth, low-volume 1 milliliter dose elicits a 14-month duration of immunity. Learn more at merckanimalhealthusa.com. Yeah, on the topic of this current outbreak, how widespread is it currently, and what threat is it currently posing to horses in the U.S.?
So current threat to the U.S. horse population, honestly, is probably pretty small. It's, as of the last case count, there was a total of 49 confirmed cases. And it's pretty much located to one small group of horses, in all honesty. So this is not widespread amongst multiple populations. Now, they have done trace outs, and they're currently undergoing investigation in other states. But of the 49 cases, 46 of them are geldings. So only 3 of these were actually breeding animals that they confirmed the disease within. And it's kind of an interesting story because when you go on the USDA APHIS website, you can read about this yourself as well. But the initial case was a mare that was bred via live cover, and she had uterine fluid after breeding. So they just cultured it. They lavaged her, cultured it, sent it off to the lab. And that's when it tested positive. When that tested positive, the mare was considered positive. And then they investigated the stallion. He, of course, came positive. And they started looking at the companions of these stallions that were on the facility and tested the geldings. And that's when the geldings started lighting up. And in their investigation process, they really believe the sheath cleaning procedures is what transmitted it, not just from gelding to stallion, but gelding to gelding. And it doesn't seem on their tracebacks that this particular outbreak actually came from the breeding stock. Those stallions that they had were bred and raised here in the U.S., and they believe it came through a gelding, but they haven't gotten to the bottom of the story. This is still ongoing, and it does involve some quarantine and testing in other states. So Florida is the primary situation, but there is horses in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. But as soon as the USDA identifies a particular interest of a traceback, that place goes under quarantine, and then they keep investigating. So it looks like most of the impact will be very focal to the Florida location. And as horse owners throughout the country, this particular outbreak is probably not a threat, but it's important to realize that the geldings and the transmission on sheath cleaning is super important as a method of transmission.
Yeah, it's so interesting how it's primarily in geldings, this outbreak. Is this going to shape USDA policies in any way? Can we expect any changes to come out of this as we learn more about, the outbreak through trace out activities?
I mean, it's too soon to speculate if the USDA is going to change any of their protocols. But as a reproductive veterinarian here in the States, it does, make me start to wonder if they will change. And, it's only speculation. There's nothing that they've got that's come from this to change any of our protocols at this time. But one of the hopes that we have is that they are considering a PCR test. It's not been validated, but it would be nice if that could come online as an option for us to use because it's faster at detecting the organism. When we do cultures, the cultures actually take 7 days from when they're received at the lab to read out. And so it's a very slow period of time before you know if you're positive or negative. But PCR testing could be much quicker. And it could also help us on screening our broodstock. So if we have stallions, we could find out much quicker on our domestic horses if they're clear. And hopefully it's equivalent to the culture process that we can trust that result's going to be as good. The other thing is the question now becomes, are geldings going to be tested on some level prior to import to the U.S. from endemic countries? But it's just way too soon to get to that point. But it does start to raise those questions.
Yeah, really interesting to see what's going to come out of this in the future. I know we touched on this a little bit already talking about the current outbreak, but what happens exactly if a horse tests positive for CEM and who becomes involved? I'm assuming the USDA needs to step in and implement quarantine restrictions, but are there any other bodies that become involved if a horse tests positive?
Yeah, so typically any of the positives that are going to be noted are actually import horses that are under quarantine already and undergoing that process. That process is supervised by states and the USDA, so they're already involved on all the imports. So those ones you typically don't hear about because it's actually stopped, treated, and controlled prior to becoming part of the US horse population. In this particular case, as soon as that horse tested positive for CEM, the mare, the initial mare on her uterine lavage fluid, that because it's a four animal disease, it's notified to the state and then immediately to the USDA. And so it is in conjunction of both state and USDA authorities that they oversee the quarantine, testing, treatment, and release process from beginning to end in that case.
And how is the condition treated exactly? How long would the horse need to be quarantined before it would be safe to release?
The treatment is actually, for both mares and stallions, not that difficult. The biggest thing, so how CM is typically treated, in a mare that had a uterine infection, she'd be treated with intrauterine antimicrobials, but the external genitalia, where it tends to try and hide out long-term, is where we treat topically with topical antimicrobials. So 2% chlorhexidine scrub is typically what's used to wash. And then SSD, silver sulfadiazine or nitrofurazone, is used to treat as a topical cream. And that treatment protocol is established by the USDA. It's been proven to work. It's done 5 days consecutively. And occasionally it does need another round, or some practitioners might choose to do longer treatment protocols just to be more certain that they covered every surface and treated it. And the topical treatments with the chlorhexidine and the SSD or furazine are also used on stallions for treatment. So the treatment's not that long, but as part of the testing protocol, because you disrupt the flora and we're relying on bacterial testing to come negative, they require a 21-day hold after you complete your treatment before you can retest. So the retesting can't start until about 3 weeks after you complete treatment. And then you undergo a retesting period to prove that that horse is either negative or positive to the disease. So for mares, that would be an additional 14 to 21 day testing protocol. And typically mares, if they've been treated appropriately, will clear at that point. If it's a stallion, the stallion testing protocol is a fair bit more extended because it involves live cover of 2 mares. And those 2 mares are then tested to see if they contract CEM. So it can carry out months if it's a stallion. In mares, it's typically much, much shorter.
It's interesting. And is there usually any long-term impacts on mares' fertility, or do they return to breeding normally after they have the disease?
And they can return to breeding normally. Once a mare clears the infection, she is not considered inhibited or damaged by it long-term. So that's great news as far as this disease goes, is the long-term impacts are very negligible. It's just a loss of time, money, and resources while you are positive or, undergoing testing.
Right. So how can veterinarians help prevent the spread of CEM? Maybe through working with their clients and just practicing good protocols themselves.
Yeah, that's the big thing, is just awareness of what the disease is and how it can travel and the impacts that it can have. But also, like for domestic horses, if you have breeding stallions, it'd be wise to at least do a set of bacterial cultures on them annually, if not more frequently, just so that you're screening your stock to know that they are negative. You can also, if you have mares that have infections, you should test and probably send them to a lab at least every once in a while to make sure that you're not growing one of these diseases, because that's how this was picked up in this particular case, that most recent outbreak. And using your proper biosecurity measures when you're using your equipment for stallion collection, making sure that you clean it between use thoroughly with disinfectants that are effective against CEM, and trying to use as much single-use product as possible. And then also something as simple as sheath cleaning, using gloves and not reusing stuff. So not a same rag or not using the same hose to do it, or being very contactless except for what you can throw away in the process.
Yeah, those are great tips. And I imagine that the disease is spread pretty frequently just through maybe horse owners or barn managers who are doing sheath cleanings and maybe aren't taking all the proper precautions. So I think that's probably pretty important to educate clients on how they can safely perform sheath cleanings without spreading disease potentially. So that's great to keep in mind. Is there anything else you would like to add on the topic before we wrap up?
I think one of the important take homes of this is that CEM helps remind us how interconnected our whole global equine community is, because in the US, we don't even typically think about CEM, and in Europe, it's pretty endemic. And so how we both deal with that within our countries, it can bring up some interesting conversations between people from both sides of the pond. But the ability for the US to be considered CEM-free is what helps protect our economy, our breeders, our ability to travel internationally without restrictions. And it's very important to continue to support this because it has long and far-reaching impacts if that were to change. So that's my big thing as a take-home on this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you shedding some light on this topic in light of the current outbreak. So, I think these take-homes are going to be really valuable moving forward. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much to our audience for listening, and a very big thank you to our sponsor, Merck Animal Health, for continuing to support the podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, please send me an email at csisson@equinenetwork.com.